Hello, friends. I'm David Bose. Today is December the 2nd. It's 2016. It's good to see everybody today. Well, I'm going to go ahead and do another video on Thoth. And I'm thinking this could take a couple of more videos. There is just a lot to cover. Whenever I start a video like this, I'm just swimming with wonder about how in the world you're going to accept this, how I can, somehow get the truth across to people and help people to understand what the real truth is. Because there's so many things that are ingrained in our mind from the time that we're born, and there's been a purposeful delusion that's been put upon our minds. We've been told a lot of lies, and the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, is purposely veiled and hidden the truth from us. I think a lot of you have gotten used to the fact that I've been trying to give you information that at first seems very remarkable, if not insane, and then I give you some evidence and it starts to make sense. But you see, none of it's going to ever make complete sense, because it's like being in a maze miles long, and then somebody comes along and gives you a little key that opens a door, and they say, now this key is going to get you out of here. And there's like 27 keys, right? And you try the first one and it works. But you go into a room that you don't understand and you're scared that maybe it's a trick. I understand that you think maybe I'm just kind of, because we got 27 keys to get through, right? And that's just some arbitrary number I just now came up with. That doesn't mean anything. But what I'm saying is it's just an illustration of the fact that we've got a long ways to go to sort through all of the lies. But I think I had to establish from the very beginning, with various videos and many, many videos, that the Old Testament God is not our Father in heaven. And then I started getting more into the information about how the priesthood of Melchizedek was so different from the Levitical, and what the Nazarenes were and the Gnostics, and this esoteric wisdom. And I tried to teach a little of that. I've also tried to explain some of the history just briefly through the Dark Ages, what's happened with the church and the burning of all the libraries of Alexandria, the Inquisitions and all that's happened, what the Freemasons were and the Templars and the Cathars who were massacred and murdered, the Constitution of the United States, and all of this information. Recently I've been hinting to the fact that there's a lot more about ancient history that we don't know. We already know. I've done some videos on the Sumerian tablets, and so this is very important. And one of the things I've made a connection in my videos with the Sumerian tablets on is that a lot of people were going along and hearing about the Sumerian tablets, and they're thinking, all right, well, so I either have to believe in the Sumerian tablets or the Bible. These are two different things. And I've been trying to integrate them to help people understand that it really isn't two different things at all. In fact, they're the exact same thing. But what I've tried to show clearly is that the Bible is an excerpt from more ancient wisdom. The Bible itself, the Old Testament itself. But it's really odd, but the Bible is written in such a way that, or we've been reading it in such a way, that we've missed a lot of it. So when we read the Bible, we miss a lot because we don't understand that there are words that are mistranslated, and it affects the whole gist of what's going on. There are words that I believe at times it seems like there are some words that are purposely mistranslated, because the reason I think it's purposeful is because the word that they use to translate it is a word that they had to come up with, that would, rather than enlighten the mind, would veil. Because it seems like modern translators sometimes use a word that would purposely veil the meaning, but not completely be wrong. They might use the word cave for a tomb. Sometimes kings were buried in caves. It says that Abraham buried Sarah in a cave. And he buried her at the big trees of Mamre in a place called Hebron. And this is a very special place. And if you read the Bible, you're going to think that Abraham was just some Arabian turban guy, wandering around in the desert with a few chickens and some camels and some donkeys, and he died on this hill and found an old cave and stuck his wife in there. The father of every religious tradition that is known to man. Friends, how is this possible that Abraham was just some guy in a tent? It says that one day this king, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, this is like the king of Persia, and he had 5 confederate kings with him, and they came down there and they took Lot, wiped out the area of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the whole of Palestine. Raided them, took them all prisoners, captive. And Abraham heard about it, and it says he got pretty upset and took 318 men and went up there and whooped the pants off these guys. So it just sounds like kind of some herdsmen squabbling over some chickens. But that's not what it's about. If you read Josephus' works, you'll see that these 318 men were officers. And they were officers that had officers and officers below them, and chieftains, and basically Abraham was the general, the king, over an army that was probably thousands. And this was basically at that time a world war. Abraham was not just some Bedouin turban guy running around in a tent. Abraham was the father of a multitude of nations. And at the time that Abraham lived, when he went to that place called the trees of Mamre, he comes to a place he calls Kiriath Arba. So, we don't know Hebrew, so why did they write it in Hebrew? See, Kiriath means the city or the stones placed on top of each other, like in a wall. This word probably means like a pyramid or pillar. This was a very famous place, Kiriath Arba, that later on they called Hebron, where Judah got its portion. And this particular place is so important. It's where Abraham was buried. It's where Isaac was buried. It's where Jacob was buried. It's where Sarai was buried. It's where Leah was buried. It's where Rebekah was buried. This place sounds like, when you're reading the Bible, it just sounds like a field, and there's some, out there in the middle of the field, he dug a little hole and threw his, Friends, the pharaohs, when they buried their dead, they embalmed them. And remember, this is the same thing. This is the same tradition. They believed in the resurrection. They embalmed their dead. They put them in tombs. They didn't just throw them out in the dirt, right? They made some sort of rock tomb. So we get the impression it was just some sort of cave or something. But these were monuments that were built. The place where Abraham died and was buried, where his wife was buried and his children, This was the holiest place you can think of, probably. This is where the great prince of the earth was buried. This is where Father Abraham was buried. You know, surely he's got a better place to be buried than... it should be like the pharaohs, right? Remember, the place where Abraham was buried was already a place where was famous some sort of Kiryat Arba, which in Hebrew means a great temple, where the Anunnaki came down and lived. Friends, this place, Kiryat Arba, was in a place that today we call the Negev. Well, here's another one of those things that we read in the Bible and we just think, oh, well, okay, that's down there in between, Israel and Egypt, right? That's that little desert. Well, that's what they call that today. Negev, just in Hebrew, means a place in the south. We don't know where it was. Today, archaeologists go down there to try and find anything in the ancient times. Remember, Israel was in the land, and then they were taken captive, and they were gone, and then supposedly they came back. Anything that's there before the captivity, archaeologists cannot even find it. There's no, supposedly these great kings, and Abraham was the great father of everything, and David and Solomon and everything, and we can't find Solomon's temple. We can't find an inscription on a stone that says this is where King David was. We haven't been able to find it. I'm telling you, friends, there is a King David. There is an Abraham. And these people were buried in great sarcophaguses and tombs that would rival anything you've ever seen in Egypt. So where are they? Well, friends, they were in the Negev, which is Hebron, Kiryat Arba, the place where the Anunnaki came down. The 4 sons. It's the place of the 4. Now, we don't know if there were 4 of the Anunnaki that originally came down, and this was Enlil and Enki and his 2 sons, or his wife, or his sister, or something. Or if it's talking about 4 monuments that was built for them. Now, in Egypt, we've got 3 great pyramids. But wherever this was, it was a place of a pharaoh. You see, here's another thing that people don't understand. In the Bible, it talks about Egypt. And we just think, oh, well, there's Egypt's down there in the south, right? And then Israel's up here in the north. Well, wait a minute. Now stop. There's 2 countries called Egypt. There's Lower Egypt and there's Upper Egypt. And it's kind of crazy because Lower Egypt's actually north. Upper Egypt's actually the southern Egypt. So, that's very confusing. So I'm just going to use the word northern and southern. Northern Egypt is up there by Goshen. And that's where the children of Israel was for like about 480 years. There's a prophecy when Abraham went down there. It doesn't say in the Bible like we think, come on, Abraham, let's go over there and I'm going to give you the land of Palestine, the land of the Jews. It doesn't say that. See, there weren't even no Jews in this period of time. Abraham was before the Jews. And Father in heaven told Abraham, come on, and let's go to a land that I will show you. And he went down there, and he went to Egypt. And he says, now, I'm going to give you this land from the river Nile all the way to the river Euphrates. That's your land. And so, Abraham sojourned in the land of Canaan, which was from the river Nile to the river of Ethiopia, or of Euphrates. And in that land, there were the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hittites, the Amorites, there were different groups of people. So, it doesn't say that Abraham was in Palestine. That word's not in there. It says he was in the area of the Negev. Most of the time he spent was in the area called the Negev or Hebron. And he went up to Sodom, to where his nephew Lot was. But he spent a lot of time talking to the king of Egypt. In fact, he married Hagar, which was a princess of Egypt. Now, do you suppose that this great Pharaoh in Egypt is going to go all the way up, hundreds of miles up to Jerusalem and talk to Abraham? And you know, when Abraham went down into this land of Canaan, it says that the Pharaoh saw his wife. And he said, oh, she's my sister. What are they having this conversation for if he's up in Palestine? And why did our Father in heaven say, I'm going to give you this land from the river Nile all the way to the Euphrates? But we don't have any archaeological diggings to find an Abraham. What we can find is someone who is got that name, but it's not going to come down through the Hebrew. We can find it in the Egyptian records. I told you before in one of my other videos, Manetho, an Egyptian historian, says that Moses was an Egyptian. Well, if you read the Egyptian histories, you'll find that the first great king of Egypt was Abraham. And it doesn't say Abraham, it says Ibram. The problem we're having is we're reading Egyptian, Hebrew, and translated into English, and so we're left in the dark. You're not going to get the word Abraham from an Egyptian word, but the consonants that are there, and it's going to, a scholar could look at it and see that the root of the word is the same root as Abraham. So here's another one of those things that we just think, all right, the Negev's down there and just south of Israel and just a little bit north of Egypt. That's what today, that little area, they call Negev. But in Hebrew, Negev just means the southern area, a place in the south. But it was also called Kiriath Arba. That is a very interesting word. Strange. As I said before, it's very curious how they translate these things. Kiriath Arba is just a transliteration. What it means, Kiriath means like stones stacked on top of each other in some sort of pillar or wall. And Arba means the four. So some say there were four men, because it says Arba was the father of the Anakim. See, we've talked about that in another video. That's the Anunnaki. It's the same root word, Anu and Ki, which is the earth. From those from heaven to earth came. Anak is just the consonants, because in Hebrew it doesn't have the vowel. So you could translate that Anak, because plural is Anakim. So it's Anak or Anaki. You could translate it either way you wanted. So the sons of the Anak or the Anakim or the Anunnaki, that's where they live. And evidently there was a large city. They translate it city, but it really doesn't just mean a city. It means a wall or a fortress or a temple or a pyramid. And so it could be four great pyramids. We're not sure exactly what that means, but it's a word that describes something very famous. And everybody knew about it. It was the place where the great giants were. The Anunnaki, who came to the earth and subjected the people and made them slaves and tried to take them and make them mine for gold. And they were building pyramids. See? Well, that's not in the Bible, Dave. Yeah, it is. See, that's where Abraham went. And that's why our Father in heaven sent him there, because he was concerned about these fallen angels. There were 200 of them who forsook Father in heaven and came to the earth and began to subjugate human beings and treat them very badly and make them slaves. So our Father in heaven sent Abraham out to go take care of this situation. And Abraham had a son by promise. They don't know how this son came to be, just like Noah. They didn't know how this son came to be. But he wasn't one of the indigenous peoples of the earth. He had blue eyes and blonde hair, and he looked like the gods. So Abraham took this holy seed, and he went down into Egypt. And he became the house of Abraham, or the house of David. That's the great house. And in Egyptian, that means Pharaoh, or the great house. And it was this line of kings that goes back to Anu, or An. In Egypt, it was the city of An, which, when the Greeks went down there, they changed the name to Heliopolis. But that was where there was this ancient throne that goes all the way back to Nibiru. It's spoken of in the Sumerian tablets. So this was this famous place. Now, we don't know if Kiriath Arba was there, but what we do know is that Abraham, when he went to the promise, when our Father in heaven says, go out from your people and go to a land that I will show you, he did not say, and I'm taking you to Palestine, to the Jewish land. There were no Jews at that time. Jews were children of Abraham. So Abraham was going to a place that he'd never been before. And where did he go? He went to Egypt. He got down there and he says, this is my sister, because he didn't want the Pharaoh to take his wife. Now there's a bigger story there too, but I don't have time to get into that. The Pharaoh isn't going to be, lusting after some Bedouin woman, right? Some slave woman, right? Abraham was a very powerful man, the father of all nations. And so Pharaoh wanted his wife because they wanted to make a treaty, basically. This was a treaty. And our Father in heaven said, no. I'm going to use your seed through your son Isaac. I'm going to provide the seed for you. So this was a divinely inspired thing, and he sent them down to Egypt. He wasn't in Palestine. He was in Egypt. You think that Abraham went down to Palestine, and the Pharaoh came up from Egypt hundreds and hundreds of miles to see Abraham's wife. It says right there that when Abraham got there, our Father in heaven told Abraham, I'm going to give you this land. From the river Nile all the way to the Euphrates. So the promised land is not Palestine. The promised land is the entire land from the Nile River all the way up to the Euphrates. And that land that he went to, sometimes it calls it Hebron. That's what they began to call it, but it was originally called Kiriath Arba, or the place where the Anunnaki went. This is what happened. They went out of, the Anunnaki went down into Africa, down into Egypt, and began to enslave the indigenous peoples. This was the land the Bible calls Havilah at one time. And it says the gold was good there. So now you understand that when Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, came out with 5 kings from 5 nations and met Abraham, and the war, they had a war, you understand that was a world war. Abraham wasn't some Arabian with a turban out there with some chickens and some donkeys and a couple of mules. Abraham had an army of thousands of men that met in battle, and perhaps that was one of the very first world wars. It was a war for power upon earth. Because you see, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, was sent down in there to have a war with Abraham. He was sent by Nimrod, king of Babel. And this was a war for world dominance. And really, this was all about, because Lot was confederate with Abraham. This was his blood. This was his part of his family. Remember, this whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Christians today just think, oh, well, that's about homosexuals. Those people down there weren't nice. So our Father in heaven, he showed them, and he rained down fire and sulfur on them. Well, actually, it has nothing to do with homosexuality. The story is about people who wanted to have relations with angels, with the Anunnaki. And the story was about these 200 fallen angels. The Bible calls them angels. This is what we call them. They were called the Anunnaki. Those from heaven to earth came. And they came to subjugate human beings and to make them their slaves. Now, Father in heaven had to do something about this. So, the people that were in Sodom and Gomorrah, they wanted to have relations with these angels, or the Anunnaki. These Anunnaki had knowledge and great technological prowess, and they were taking over the human beings and enslaving mankind. So our Father in heaven protected Lot, which is a story about certain seed that our Father was protecting. A certain seed that was going to come into the world. You see, Abraham was sent there to protect the indigenous peoples on this earth. And this is why when they went into Egypt, they tried to murder all the children. They didn't want these little boys to grow up and join an army, and then they would be defeated. This is what was happening. Abraham had an army, and he had 318 officers and thousands of people in his army. And they had this war to protect those people that were in confederation with Abraham, those people who were in line and who accepted the rule of Melchizedek, which is the line of kings of the great pharaohs. So you see, Abraham went to Egypt, but he went, which is from the river Nile all the way to the Euphrates. And there were two Egypts. There was the upper Egypt and the lower Egypt. The lower Egypt's actually the northern part of Egypt. And that's the part that we know of as Goshen. This is where Abraham went down, and that's where Heliopolis is, which is the Greek word. They changed the name to Heliopolis, but in those days it was called the city of An. An is the Sumerian god. And this is where they started the line of kings. On the earth, the holy seed that was put into the Nile, like Osiris was put on the Nile River and Moses was pulled out of the Nile, the Misa, or the Messiah, that would one day save mankind. This was our Father's plan to bring down this seed to rule over mankind in love, to enlighten mankind, because these other beings were going and enslaving everybody. So they started a throne in Egypt. Well, Joseph was in Egypt, and he made friends with the southern part of Egypt, and they allowed him to be king over all of Egypt. But then after Joseph died, it says that the Pharaoh, which would have been the Pharaoh of the southern part of Egypt, they did not know Joseph. See, they didn't remember their agreement. And so they began to enslave the northern half, or the Israelites that lived in Goshen. Israel had lived in Goshen for 480 years. They were Egyptians. And who ruled over the people in Goshen? Pharaohs. They were the northern pharaohs. They were the ones that goes back to On, that holy seed, from Abraham down to David. Now remember, we can't find David in Palestine before the captivity of Israel. The archaeologists can't find David, Solomon, the temples, the cities. They have no idea about any of this archaeology. You would think that Abraham, the father of all nations, would be at least as, easy to find as one of the great pharaohs. Well, he is. And if you go back, try about 2000 BC in the Egyptian line of kings, in the pharaohs, you'll see there was a king with the name Eber on the end of this long epithet. And of course, in Egyptian, it's going to be spelled differently, and there's no vowels, and it's going to look different. The first pharaohs in this last line, because some of the older pharaohs were Nut and Set, and the sun and the moon and so forth, astrological forces. But when you get down to the pharaohs that rule on earth as humans, the first pharaoh is a guy named Eber. That's Abraham. And then his son is Jacobar, and that is Jacob. And there's also all the pharaohs that were called Hotep. Again, that's just one way to spell it. But Joseph is another way they spell that, which is Joseph. And so there was a long line of pharaohs that had the title of Joseph, just as there were a long line of pharaohs that had the title of Moses or Moses. And this was the anointed king of Moses. It was an epithet. So, like I said, everything that the Bible says that one of these kings did, you can't find it in archaeology, but you can find it in the stories of the Egyptian pharaohs. And so now we understand why we get esoteric wisdom from Egypt. The esoteric wisdom came from Joseph and from Enoch. Enoch is related to the Egyptian god Thoth. And Thoth was the one who wrote the sciences and gave all the wisdom and wrote it down in this great book. And so this is what we want to understand. What is this book? Because this book, the book of Enoch or the book of Thoth, was handed down, and the great pharaohs had this wisdom because they were in this great priesthood, this priest-king line, and they embodied this wisdom. Now there's a story in Egypt about a king named Setna.